Hey everyone, Rob B here with Rob D. And the scary headline is true. Rent freezes are coming. We're going to talk about where and why they could end up impacting every single part of the UK. This isn't clickbait, and you need to know what's happening.
Welcome to the Property Podcast. Thank you for joining us. Yes, it's a Thursday morning, and that means that we're sharing some of our knowledge and our perspective from operating in the property industry every day for free. As Robert said, it's serious stuff that we're talking about today. Really important for all investors to know about. So if you know anyone who's operating in the property space and doesn't listen to the podcast, encourage them to have a listen. Send it their way. Maybe even encourage them to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. But we'll be talking about all of that in just a second. And make sure you stick around to the end as well, because in Hub Extra, we're going to be sharing a technique to help you get more out of your reading.
Loads coming up in this podcast. I normally do the news story of the week at this time, but we felt with the sad news of the passing of Queen Elizabeth that we didn't want to do a news story this week. Her Majesty was a wonderful, wonderful servant to the UK and the Commonwealth and the world. So in light of that, we've decided not to do a news story this week, and normal business will be resumed next week.
Politicians have tended not to be property investors' best friends over recent years. It all started, of course, in 2015 with the changes to the tax system, which have made Budget Day one of the more nervy days of the year ever since. But actually, even though property is always in the news and always being talked about, in terms of political interference, the last few years have actually been pretty quiet. It's almost like there's been something else going on taking everyone's attention. But that has come to an abrupt stop. Firstly, a couple of months ago with the rental reform white paper, which we did a dedicated episode about at the time. We've got a YouTube video on that as well. That was a big deal, and you might think that was enough to see us through the rest of the year. But no, there have been major developments in just the last month in holiday lets, and then within the last week, developments in Scotland, which actually shocks me. I thought I was pretty unshockable when it came to politics and property, but this is a bit of a stunner. So in this episode, we're going to bring you up to date on those more recent developments around what's happening in Scotland and what's happening with holiday lets. And if you don't own property in Scotland and you don't own holiday lets, don't just switch off and think this isn't for you, because as we'll hear, all this really is just part of a bigger picture.
So Rob, you said you're shocked. I'm presently stunned because as we record this, it's not long been announced, but you were the one who actually broke the news to me. And I've not had much time to prepare for this podcast other than just absorbing what's been announced. Obviously, there's so much going on in the world right now. Maybe you listening don't even know that rent freezes are being introduced. So, Rob, enlighten me and many of our listeners. This is probably news to a lot of people right now. What is happening?
Okay, so there are two parts to this. So I'll talk about both of them, and then I think we should probably attack each one in turn. This all came from an announcement by Nicola Sturgeon on the 6th of September, where she was talking about the cost of living crisis and what they were going to do about it, and various different measures across different parts of the economy. But two really big measures when it came to property. She announced that there was going to be a rent freeze over the winter, and she announced that along with that, there would be a ban on evictions. Now, this all came from a speech, and so the legislation to actually back it up, I don't believe has been published yet. And this is going to be fast-tracked through, so it's not one of those things where something will be announced and then years later it'll actually happen. It is going to happen soon, but right now we don't have the letter of all the detail. But the understanding is that both of these, the evictions ban and the rent freeze, will start pretty much immediately and last through until at least, always a scary word when a politician says it, at least the end of March. So there you go, Rob. Reaction?
Like you said at the beginning of this, I just didn't think politicians would go this far. And seemingly out the blue as well. I know there is a cost of living crisis and we can't ignore that. And I'm sure this will be popular as a policy in Scotland. But we've seen over the long term from other countries across the world that when you try to manipulate a market and control its pricing, it fails. It takes time, but it fails ultimately. The system breaks down. I mean, there's been pictures of queues of people, seemingly hundreds of people long, queuing to try and get rental properties in Ireland. And that's down to government meddling and the measures they've introduced there. And what's ultimately happened in Ireland, if you've not seen those pictures, is because of the meddling, there's a lack of rental stock because a lot of landlords have exited the market. And build to rent and PRS is challenging in Ireland as well. So there hasn't been anyone to pick up the baton and serve that market either. So Ireland's got a real problem at the moment with lack of rental stock. There's a fraction of the properties on the market that compared to what they used to have. And if Scotland goes down this route in the long term, and it might not be, this might be short-term measures, because like you say, Rob, there's very little information right now. But if this becomes popular, and Nicola Sturgeon thinks, oh wait, I'm onto something here, this is a vote winner, and pushes this on further, she could be creating a much, much bigger problem for herself further down the line. Because if you're an investor in Scotland and you're not emotional about where you're investing, are you going to buy your next buy-to-let in Scotland right now? Or are you going to go over the border? I know where I'd do.
Yeah, agreed. And I think of the two, it's actually the evictions ban that I found the most shocking and in a way the most worrying, because rent freeze has its own issues. But actually, my understanding is that only applies to existing tenancies. So when a tenancy ends, you can put the rent up and to whatever you want for the new tenancy. And within a tenancy in Scotland, there are all kinds of rules already that regulate rent increases. So I don't think that, practically speaking, that's going to make all that big of a difference. But the eviction ban is another thing entirely. And this is what would make me extremely nervous as a landlord. Because we had this before with COVID. So you could say, oh, well, it's just the same thing again. But actually, I think a couple of very important things are different this time around. One is that at the time, because everything was so nuts, lots of things are put in place to protect everyone in different ways. And so, for example, you couldn't evict tenants, but then you could also get a mortgage holiday. So as a property owner, you'd still have some costs, but at least you wouldn't be needing to meet your mortgage payments. This time, you could have a tenant who stops paying rent and doesn't pay rent through till the end of March, and there's nothing you can do about it, and you still have to pay your mortgage and all the costs associated with that property. And the other thing that's different is that whether you agreed with what happened last time or not, round about when COVID was kicking off, it was an extreme time. A lot of things were happening. You kind of see how this made sense at the time, even if you didn't agree with it. This time, it feels like landlords have been singled out to help, in air quotes, with what's going on in terms of prices. No one else is being told what they can and can't do. No one else is having to freeze their prices, but landlords are having to. And presumably that's because they can, and it's a politically easy target. And that, for me, Rob, is the most worrying thing of all, because, oh, hang on, we got away with this once, now we're going to do it again, and now we can just keep on doing it because it appears to be a vote winner and there are no ill effects until, as you were hinting at, perhaps at some point there are ill effects, by which point the situation is much worse and it's hard to do anything about it.
That's it. If this lasts just for the winter and then it's all scrapped, then while it's annoying for investors and landlords in Scotland, it's not going to be the end of the world. It's another blip. If these things happen, we've had lots of challenges as investors over the years. This is just another one. The phrase, at least, in that announcement is the scary part. Because if it's popular, because it could be, and they could really dine off that they've introduced rent freezes and eviction bans, if these things continue for the long term, it's not that hard to see of another version of the world where people just give up on the buy-to-let market in Scotland, go across borders, whether England, Wales, Northern Ireland, wherever, and go, okay, I'll invest here instead. I'll do it here because it's very similar. The setup's the same. I know what I'm doing. I speak the language. So let's do it here because Nicola Sturgeon doesn't want my investment. And if that happens, this might be a good short-term thing for tenants in Scotland. They feel like they've got a win here, and maybe they have. But if this turns into a medium-term thing or a long-term thing, then this is bad news for tenants. And it might not turn into a long-term thing. Let's stress that. We don't know at this point. But if it does, I worry for that market, and then I worry for tenants ultimately in Scotland. Now, if you said that to them, they'd go, oh, whatever, you're not worried. I don't have any investments in Scotland. So I'm not emotionally tied to this conversation. This is just me looking at it practically and seeing a scenario where this could end up being a bad scenario for tenants in Scotland. Landlords will sell up. If this carries on for long enough, landlords will sell up and less landlords will enter the market as well. I mean, why would you choose to enter a market with those conditions? The interesting thing, Rob, or you could use the word worrying, is if this proves popular and a vote winner, that across the borders, it is introduced as a policy there as well. If England and Wales and Northern Ireland introduce these measures, then it suddenly becomes a level playing field. And it's bad news everywhere, and you don't go across borders to invest. So my question is, Rob, one that you probably can't answer unless you've found that magic crystal ball of yours, will other nations in the UK follow?
That is a big question. And we have seen lots of measures that started in Scotland coming to England and Wales. The changes in the rental reform white paper, for example, which I mentioned earlier, a lot of those are very, very similar to what's already happened in Scotland. So it's not out of the question. I'm not trying to scare anyone. I'm not trying to say, sell up now, it's all over, this is going to come our way, be scared. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying it's not out of the question. My hope is that this is shown very clearly to be a bad idea quite quickly, and so no one else is tempted to copy it. Because I get the appeal in terms of political messaging, and so it's the kind of thing where you would look at that and go, oh, yeah, it seems good, people seem to like it, it's very easy for people to understand, it gets a quick result, let's do it. But hopefully it will be shown to be a bad idea and it won't end up spreading to everywhere else. And I think, Rob, it will be shown to be a bad idea because actually I'm a little bit less relaxed about it than you were in terms of something you mentioned earlier. If this is just for this winter and it's a one-off, then probably no long-term damage. But I'm not sure. I think this could actually be really damaging simply because everyone will be thinking, well, hang on, if they've done this once, what's to stop them doing it again? What's to stop them doing this every winter? Or what's to stop them doing it every time inflation picks up or every time unemployment creeps up or whatever? They've proven that they can and will do it, so they might do it again, and therefore I don't want to be involved in that. And I wouldn't have thought that would just be at a private landlord level. Surely institutions will be looking at this as well, build-to-rent operators will be going, well, okay, as an institution, we're better able to weather things like this if we need to, but why would we go and invest there? So I wouldn't be surprised if you saw the pipeline of build-to-rent drying up north of the border. Because again, why would you take that political risk if it's very clearly there? So I don't know, Rob, the answer to the question. And maybe we're wrong. Maybe this actually is going to be a brilliant idea with no ill effects. But if it's not, and I don't think it is, then my hope is, although there'll be collateral damage in the process, I hope it doesn't go well. And so nobody, including the Scottish Government, is tempted to do it again.
And I think that's it. If it goes well in terms of a political capital point of view, and they stop it, then yes, as investors, whether as individuals or institutions, they're going to be nervous. And some then may withhold investment. So it's a fair challenge, Rob. I could see why that could play out. If in the short term it's not seen as a win and it's not been so popular, then maybe it's not a thing and investors will just move on and go, well, he tried that clearly failed. It wasn't as popular as they thought it might be. I'm happy to carry on investing. If you ask me now how I feel about investing in Scotland compared to 24 hours ago, I wasn't really looking much then, but I feel less incentive to look now. That's a short-term reaction, but will those short-term reactions turn into longer-term reactions? And if they do, that's not good news for the Scottish tenants. And you might listen cynically and go, oh, yeah, of course you care about the tenants, but we don't invest in those markets. This is just my analysis of looking at a market that I don't invest in. And I truly believe if this runs on and confidence in that market from an investor's point of view diminishes, then so will the experience for tenants over the long term.
I think that's right. And politically, what I don't quite get is if it's a perfectly reasonable position to say we don't want any private involvement in the rental sector. You may not agree with it, but if you held that as a position, that's fine. But then that would need to be taken over by public investment. So you need to have loads and loads of social housing, which again is a totally fair enough thing to do. But you very rarely see politicians talking about that in a serious way. If they came out and outright said, we don't like private landlords, we don't want them, we're going to push them out, we're going to build all these millions of houses instead, and the state's going to do it, and it's going to be great, then that would actually make a lot more sense, whether you agree with it or not. But just pushing private landlords around, including institutional private landlords, without having anything else in there to take up the slack, I do think that that is very risky from a tenant perspective. It does seem like a bit of a gamble, or maybe an assumption that you can just keep on pushing and pushing and doing whatever you want, and private landlords will just take it. But I do think a point will come where they won't. And is this that point, or is that one for the future? Don't know, but it's going to be very interesting to see what plays out.
So the private rental sector has had a tremendous amount of attention, and some would say unwanted attention, from the governments across the UK. This has been the case, not just Scotland. An area that's kind of been left alone for now because it's been a very immature market has been the holiday lets. But that now is starting to get attention. So, Rob, holiday lets, why have they become popular? I'm sure quite a few people can guess why they are popular. But then moving on from that, why have they started to become controversial? And why are people against holiday lets? And that may explain why this regulation is starting to happen.
But there's a couple of reasons for this. So the more recent one is, of course, COVID, in that there's now more demand for holiday accommodation within the UK. Apparently, this is one of those stats where it doesn't sound quite right, but apparently 77% of Brits chose to have their summer holiday in the UK this year rather than going abroad. I don't know what the figure was a few years ago, but I'm sure it was lower. So, of course, when there is more demand, more supply will appear to match it. But I think the root cause actually goes back further than that, and actually tying it all back in goes back to the tax changes of 2015. Because when George Osborne announced those changes that we're all very familiar with now, but were pretty shocking at the time, holiday lets were left out of it, which means that tax-wise, overnight, holiday lets became relatively more attractive compared to long-term lets. And then, as time has gone on and more legislation has been introduced on the long-term rental sector, again, short lets have been left relatively alone. So you kind of got to a point where it's like, well, hang on, there's more demand for this, the tax treatment is better, and I don't have to worry about what happens if someone moves in and won't pay and I can't get rid of them, which is another area that politicians have been involved in, and so on and so on. More and more people have been leaving the long-term sector to go into the short-term sector, or if they were getting into property, have just gone straight into short-term lets. But then why is it controversial? Well, the increase has been so large and it's been so concentrated in different spots that it has started to have negative effects on certain areas. Because this is a bit different from the long-term sector, where if a landlord in the long-term sector sells up, it either goes to another landlord or it goes to an owner-occupier. And maybe you've got more people renting than you'd want to, and maybe prices are too high and all this stuff, but the overall supply of housing is the same and it's unaffected. But as more people shift across to the short-term sector, that actually decreases the amount of accommodation available in the long-term sector. So when that's happening at great scale in places like Cornwall and the Lake District, then that means less housing available for locals, and it also means more pressure on local services in some respects. Of course, there are some benefits as well that come with tourism, but I think, Rob, that's the nub of it. You've got quite a big shift happening, and it's disproportionately affecting quite a small number of places. And I think it's probably fair to say that while there are benefits, those benefits are outweighed by the negative factors, which of course, again, means that politicians want to get involved.
They do, and they have. Changes have begun. So let's do a quick recap because they are different. It's been approached different ways. But Rob, let's take everyone through quickly what's actually happened.
Yeah, so Scotland went first, as is becoming a bit of a theme. So in late 2021, they passed a law that means all holiday let accommodation needs to be licensed by 2024. So all holiday lets will need a license. And they've also introduced the concept of control areas, which means that a local authority can apply to the government to be a control area, which means that if you want to set up a new holiday let, you need to have planning permission. And Edinburgh recently became the first city to become a control area. So in Edinburgh, you'll need planning permission to create a new holiday let. And if they want to, they can just say no to all of them. And so there'll be no more supply. So that's Scotland. In Wales, very similar, but more recent. Only in the last couple of months, they announced that holiday lets would also be licensed. And they've also amended the planning system to differentiate between main homes, long-term lets, second homes, and holiday lets. And by making that differentiation, they can then treat them differently by having different tax rates, for example. And I think that's interesting to split it into those three, which is not something I haven't seen before. So that's Wales, which seems to be going down a similar kind of route. England, nothing yet. But Rob, I think yet is the key word there when you consider some of the themes that we've talked about already in this episode.
Yet, and possibly to sound controversial on a property podcast, and I know you said similar on your YouTube video, Rob, probably needed. It's got to a point because it's been a free-for-all and the market has been so well developed over the last few years that it does need some sort of regulation. I'm not one for regulation's sake. But when you're dealing with people's homes and communities and a market is shifted because of that, and it has already, this is not something that might happen, it already has, people have been affected who live in these areas, then some sort of regulation, light touch regulation, is needed just to make sure that the not so good operators in this market, and they exist in every market, are weeded out or discouraged from behaving that way. And If you want to know more on the detail of exactly what's happened, because there is more to know and understand on this subject, and also a little bit has happened in England in terms of steps towards this being introduced, you want to check out a YouTube video we put out recently on the Property Hub YouTube channel. Search for Property Hub UK. Rob's done a great job of taking you through all that information. It's a popular video, and in a few minutes you'll be really well informed. And if you're there, you may as well subscribe. But coming back to our view on this, I think it's two extremes, right? We've got the private rental sector where there seems to be no end of regulation and attention and meddling and going too far, I certainly feel anyway, going too far with what they do. And then you've got a whole other market that up until the last sort of 12 months has been ignored. And people have been able to do what they want when they want. I think, Rob, there's only so long for this tax break that people have who invest through holiday lets. I can't see this going on because it's low-hanging fruit for the government, because no one's going to push back too much because they'll just say, well, now it's in line with everything else. I'm going to make a prediction. In the next 24 months, I expect to see tax changes to the holiday lets market. I know you think similar, and you talked again about this in your YouTube channel, that you think it's inevitable as well. But some regulation, I think, is welcomed and needed. And I'm not saying taxes are welcome or needed, but probably expected.
Yeah, I think so. I think the discrepancy between short-term and long-term is too great. I completely agree on the tax point. That just seems like a really easy win for them to change, and probably quite a powerful one as well in terms of influencing investor behaviour. But there is this real gulf in legislation between the two sectors. And it does feel a bit strange to be kind of agreeing with the need for more of it in holiday lets when we've just been railing against it when talking about long-term lets. But I don't think that position is actually as inconsistent as it first seems for reasons that we've gone into. So the theme of this episode has been politics, has been laws, has been interference, which you could say is needed or you could say is a negative. But Rob, to try and wrap this up, this isn't an easy question, but how do you think property investors as a whole should be feeling, even if you're not directly affected by what's happening in Scotland or what's happening with and might happen in the future with holiday lets? Should we be feeling nervous about what else might happen in the future? Is this all a sign of more things to come, or are we just having a bit of an emotional reaction to something significant that just happened? Try and give us some context on this.
Well, I think we have to look at the trend. What's the trend been to housing and to investors and landlords over the last few years from all sides of the government? And that trend is more regulation and more taxes. This isn't just an announcement today. We could go back through the years of all the changes, whether it be stamp duty or how tax is applied to property investment. There's so much that's changed for property investors over the last few years. So how should landlords, investors feel when it comes to property? I do think slightly nervous because we have a trend, right? And we're yet to see that trend book. And maybe a new government, a new prime minister, maybe she will decide to reverse that trend and start to encourage investment. I'm not confident, but maybe that could happen. But what is probably more likely to happen is when they start to see rental shortages in the more medium term, it won't happen straight away. Someone will finally click and go, you know what? If we disincentivize people to invest in this market, in this sector, there's going to be less of these properties. And actually, that's not going to be a good thing because we then will have a rental shortage. And then that picture in Ireland of people queuing to get a rental property will become commonplace. Now, we're a long way from that, so I'm not trying to be dramatic. And at the moment, it's a great market to still operate, and you can do very well. And let's not lose sight that if you've owned property over the last 24 months, your wealth has increased. You've done very well from property with the capital gains you would have enjoyed. So it's not like we don't win here either. But at some point, if you move the goalposts that much that it just becomes ridiculous to operate in this market, people will exit the market. And if they exit the market, then that's bad news for tenants. So, sorry, Rob, I know I'm normally the one who gives the positive, don't worry, it's going to be all right at the end of the pod, and maybe it is just a short-term emotional reaction. But I'm not feeling good about the current trend. And it's going to take a lot more for people to exit the market. It's not like we're on a knife's edge here, but I don't like the way the trend is going.
Well, we can't leave the episode on that note, so we'll need to give you something extra in the form of Hub Extra. Let's brighten things up a bit with a resource before we finish. And Rob, you brought along something really interesting today.
You're right, Rob. Let's leave on a positive. And this really is a positive because this has changed my world when it comes to reading. And as you'll know, if you're a long-term listener to the podcast, Rob and I love reading. Whether it's physical books, ebooks, Audible, we love it all. We just can't get enough. But something I've really struggled with over the years is if I pick a book up, unless it's truly awful, I won't abandon it. So let's just say a book's good. It's not great, it's not brilliant, it's just a good book, pretty decent. But the reason it's only a decent good book is because there are parts that clearly aren't good overall. But I will read page after page, start on page 1 and go right to the end. And then ultimately what happens is I procrastinate. I don't read that book because I'm finding it harder work than I really should. And I'll end up starting a new book and I'm halfway through one and then I'm on to another. And then I might finish that book and then pick up that book again, persevere a bit and then start another book. Not great. So what I've done is I've reframed my way of thinking when it comes to reading. And I can't take credit for this. This is a way of thinking that was introduced to me by listening to some of the stuff that Naval Ravikant has put out. A book I mentioned a little while back, an audio book called The Almanac of Naval Ravikant, is really good. It's not a book of sorts. It's just a collection of all the thoughts he's put out to the world, put into an Audible book that you can listen to and kind of absorb those lessons. You can pick it up for free as well online, I believe. So if you like what he says about reading, then you may want to check out some of his other stuff. But what he said about reading is that you're under no obligation to read every single page, and he doesn't, and nor should you. Reading is for enjoyment and to learn. So if you are going through a book and you're not enjoying that particular section or chapter, just move on to the next one. And if you find that you continue to do that with the book, then put it down. If the book has got to give you value or pleasure, and if it's not giving you those things, then don't commit. So what I've started to do is, if I've got to a chapter of a book where I'm finding it dragging or not that relevant or interesting, I've started to jump ahead and move forward a few pages to see if it gets better, and then if it doesn't, move forward a chapter. It now means I'm starting to get through books again, but it also means I'm starting to enjoy reading again, which is the most important thing. And I know this sounds super obvious, right? Well, if you're not enjoying it, move on. But so many of us will persevere with books. I don't know why. It's like we're told when we're young, like you pick up the book and you read it to the end. That's what we did in school, right? You couldn't just half read a book. You had to read it all. And maybe it's that teaching that has stuck with us as adults. But I've really struggled with this, and I hadn't even thought of the obvious of just doing what I've said. But listening to someone else talk about their approach to reading really opened my eyes, changed the way I frame the world of reading, and has brought me so much joy and has helped me get through more books. So if this helps just even a handful of people listening today, then I think this is a hub extra worth sharing.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's something that I've heard before, whether it's from him or from someone else, but I've really struggled to do it. I very occasionally will, but I've got this very deeply ingrained thing, maybe it is from school, of, you start at the beginning and you work your way through to the end. So I think giving everyone the idea and the permission to take the approach that you've just said is really worthwhile. And I'm sure this generalizes to other things as well. You can do it with podcast. You can do it with this podcast if you want to.
Whoa.
So it's okay. I feel safe that no one will, because it's just solid gold all the way. But you can. And there's so much great stuff out there now, far more than there ever has been before. You just got access to absolutely everything. There'll never be time to read or listen or whatever to all of it. So being super selective is a pretty good strategy.
You know what another good strategy is? Joining us on Tuesday for Ask Rob and Rob. And also checking out our YouTube channel as well. So much more going on our YouTube channel right now. So check out Property Hub UK on YouTube. You really are missing out if you've not checked that out yet. So much good stuff being pumped out week after week. And something else that's being pumped out week after week for many, many years now is the Property Podcast, approaching episode 500. Wowzers. We haven't missed the week in all those years, and we will not miss next week. So join us then for another episode of the Property Podcast. We'll see you then. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.